So the last bit of time we've got is panel discussion. So Neil, if you're okay, you've still got a bit of time.
Sure.
Firstly, thank you so much once again for your talk. But we have a few other panelists to invite back to continue this discussion, but also to have a little bit more of an overview on some of the other talks we've had today. So I believe, okay, Mate, if you're still around to join from our previous panel discussion.
Yes, I'm here.
Fantastic. And John, I think also if you're also free and available to join us, fantastic. Thank you, John. Thank you very much for joining us. And then also Michael, I don't know if you're free to join us as well. Fantastic.
Yeah, I'm
Brilliant.
here.
Yes, I think we've got everyone. So, Arsen, I think I'm going to hand over for you for a few questions. But if you've got any questions in the chat again, please put your hand up, and it'd be great to have you join as well. So hopefully we can have a really good kind of wrap up to join this session. So, Arsen, maybe if you want to start us off with the first question.
Yeah, thanks for the brilliant presentation. I think like your presentation really like ties up all the talks what we had before, like today and the previous conferences. Why I say so is because we have like some common language and common ground, like about repurposing and about the duplication, right? In the beginning of the today talk by Silvestro, we was having like a bit of discussion about like a soft embodiment. Is like when you have, if for the amputees, you can have like artificial limbs, or you can have another limbs, and some part of the sensory system can be basically repurposed for something else, right? This flexibility basically helps us to adapt to the new, like changing environment. Yeah, so can you give us a bit of comments from this point of view?
So one of the things, that's been, I think, of increasing importance in the evolutionary world, which I think tethers to what you've been saying, what you said, is that evolvability becomes a very important concept. That is, there's some lineages in evolution that are much more evolvable than others. And you can put it the other way. There's some that aren't very evolvable, and there's some. So what's behind evolvability? And that ability to generate diverse structures, right? So some lineages are able to fly, to swim, to run, to jump. They evolve very quickly. Others don't evolve at all, right? So what's the substrate for evolvability? It was just kind of, I'm trying to reinterpret what you said in an evolutionary sense. And so basically, I think some of them would be fairly obvious, some not so much. So one thing from the evolutionary point of view is, and we don't know why this happens, but some lineages have genetic mutations that occur at very slow rates. So if your genome changes at very slow rates, obviously you're not going to be very evolvable. That's key. But there's a couple other patterns that fit in here. So one of the common patterns we see, whether you look at animals or whether you look at whatever you want to look at, typically the earliest phase in the evolution of the group, what you see is more evolvability, not less. So usually in the early stages of the evolution of a system, there's usually lots of different experiments, and many of them failed experiments, but you see lots of evolvability. Then certain lineages get fixed, and then they evolve in their own pathway. But there's an evolvability you see, a flexibility you see early in the evolution of groups that is kind of lost later, And so there's a lot of reasons why people speculate that might be the case. And one maybe systems are freer to change early on, maybe because they have fewer network relationships, they're not as tethered to one another in certain ways that individual pieces can change. Or maybe, like you say, so maybe what you have is less specialization, more generalization. So if you have a structure that's very generalized and can do a lot of different functions, that's much more evolvable in some ways. Not entirely, but there could be exceptions, than one that is very specialized for one particular function, So generality versus specificity is kind of one thing. I think that's what you were saying in terms of functional work. So that's typically, so what we have is groups that have that generality. They tend to be more robust to extinction, because if the world changes, they can adjust with the world. Whereas something that's highly specialized is making a bet on one way of making a living, and they have a greater extinction risk. Also, their evolvability is probably a little bit lower, although I don't want to commit to that because it could be, I could argue the opposite to some extent. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, another question is like we talk a lot about like bio-inspired robotics here. Like we kind of have a lot of inspirations from the biology to build the robots, and I think like maybe it's a good time to give it back the other way around, like to take some like research in the simulation, research in the robotics, and try to figure out some like a specific behavior back at the time, right? We have like a very good simulation environments, and we can do, yeah. I know that you and Michael are working on some fascinating projects about this thing. Maybe you can give a bit of comments on that.
Yeah, well, Michael's got he's working this paper. It's really great, paleo robotics, which is really kind of exciting. The reason why I'm interested in this is that I think robotics can give us, going that direction from robotics to biology, can tell us things I would never know otherwise. That is, if you had a robotic system which can simulate how, say, a tiktaalik-like animal walked in the water, I could look at energy consumption. I could look at kinematics in ways that I could never do with it. What are the consequences of certain kinds of changes? What's the consequence of changing that ridge, which I showed you about? You can build a robot, first principles, something like that, that looks the consequences of changing the size and shape of limbs, the ways that muscles would attach, that kind of thing, and see the kinematic and energetic context of consequences of those changes in a way that I can never do with just studying fossils, or even just studying living creatures, analogs, because they can't be precise, and yeah. So, and you can ask questions in a novel way, I think, that would inform, because remember, what we don't have is, I don't find living organisms. I'm finding bits and pieces of dead ones, right? And I have to animate them, right? Well, how do you animate them? How do you understand the consequences of that animation from, again, kinematics and energetics and power generation, how they interact with a substrate, all that stuff, which I think which are huge unknowns in paleo. I think robotics has the potential to just change the landscape.
Yeah, I have like one quick question to Mate. Mate, like you were also presenting like a bit of evolution today, like about the evolution of the intelligence, right? The brain, how the sensory things. Can you like give a bit of comments on that side, like with based on current discussion?
Right. Yeah, so I don't know what Neil, for example, thinks. So I was discussing these, large foundation models, like what AI now uses, combining, data from language and from vision, and then they train, which is a bit like evolve a gigantic brain that can function across different robot bodies, or at least that's where they are heading. They cannot really do it at this point. So do you think that this is, how different is this from evolution? And do you think this is actually possible given the computational power that we now have, having like a brain that is evolved for many bodies?
Yeah, no, I think, I actually, this is a point I was actually going to put in the talk and I forgot, but I was going to say that the control mechanisms behind the different bodies tend to be more similar than the bodies themselves. That is, what you find are, and again, this is touching on your point a little obliquely, but the idea being that the pattern generators, the central nervous system's pattern generators for walking and swimming, swallowing, all that stuff, right? They tend to have more similarities than the structures they control among different creatures. So again, I'm saying the answer, what I'm saying is yes, that, you could see how you can have a very complex control system. I'll just call it that, for lack of a better word. You probably have your own more precise jargon, but that having that is your kind of superpower, because if that is relatively complex, and that can evolve by duplication and divergence and co-option, all the stuff we talked about, you're adding segments and pieces to the network and so forth, that can control vastly different bodies, and having a generative system or control system that can do that, I think, can explain some of the evolvability too. mean, one thing we see, just to give it a more precise answer, is you see alternating gaits in animals appearing over and over and over again. And the neural control for that is very similar, whether they're sharks or people or, zebras. And so it seems to be that's a very versatile yet very robust system, which is at the control side, so I don't know if I answered. I mean, I'm hitting it from different angles.
I think so. So in a way, there will be like reoccurring patterns in, let's say, the evolved neural systems, right? Some kind of motifs. And because evolution is conservative, it tries to work with, what it has there, right? And since the bodies have evolved in the meantime, maybe the neural systems have not necessarily evolved as much. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think the motif idea is very powerful. And that is, you could duplicate these motifs and reconnect them in new ways, right? And that having these motifs that can reassemble in different ways can give the system a lot of flexibility. We see that in biochemistry all the time, right? With, protein motifs and genetics and so forth.
Right.
But I think the same holds for higher order structures as well.
Right. So now, sorry, just one point. So in AI, they have the transformer and the convolutional neural networks are these motifs that can be then used, throughout for all robots.
I'll let the roboticist answer that one.
Yeah.
The other thing that's, I think, we've discussed a lot today is materials. And again, just to bring in Rob here, what about the evolution of materials and material intelligence? How is that encoded, kind of developed, and what can we learn from evolution to make better kind of robotic materials? Just if anyone has any insights, either from either side.
My talk is going to be about that. Wait a second.
Yeah, so I was gonna kind of ask Neil a quick question. So you talked about how things are, you see alternating gaits in many different animals, right? But we also see some very different body plans, like invertebrates, where material properties and this is such a big part of their intelligence. Where do you think, I guess, do you think there's a big dividing line between how invertebrates behave and evolved versus how vertebrates behaved and evolved? Or do you think there's even still there's a lot of commonalities that we can take away?
Well, I think the commonalities would be more about the physics of interacting with a substrate, the relationship between body size and scale. There's a certain kind of global parameters, I think, that would be very similar. But what's different is their materials are very different. When you're dealing with, getting back to Joseph's question, you have mucopolysaccharides, which have very different properties than bone, and bone's a much more rigid and a much more dynamic tissue. I mean, so what we tend to forget is that bone doesn't only provide the sort of the mechanical tool to walk, but it also can remodel, which is really big, and it can remodel in the face of in a dynamic environment, which when you're an invertebrate, you have to molt to do that, right? So it can't really grow in the same way to change shape. So the materials do have different opportunities and constraints. But I would think, when you look at, like, say, an invertebrate walking with an alternate gait, it'll have very similar properties. Its neural control will be very different because, remember, in one, you're going to have a dorsal hollow nerve cord, a different kind of central nervous system in one versus the other. But the outputs can be very similar. You can have an alternating gait, and you see them all the time in insects and things like that. And the physics and mechanics of it can be very similar. But where they will differ, I think, is, again, getting back to the material piece. Bone is a very different tissue than a mucopolysaccharide. And it behaves differently as creatures grow, as I said before. And also bone can remodel very actively in a dynamic relationship with its mechanical environment. So it'll be very different too. But yeah, so same but different in some ways. Yeah, that's a good question.
Just a bit like to shift the discussion to a different direction. Like if you remember, like today there was a talk by Mariana, like it's like a sperm carrying robots. So basically, in one way or another, we are kind of intervening natural selection process, right? We are changing genetics of the current animals and so on, right? Basically, after this period of time, like the animals and human will evolve in a different way, right? Is there any way to do a sort of prediction or forecasting, like based on the knowledge from the past and based on what we are doing now, where it really goes?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, right? If I knew that, I'd be very wealthy. I mean, yeah, there was a question that appeared in the chat box that caught my eye, and which relates back to this is, our relationship with technology is changing, right? And it's changed in the last, when you look at like humanity's relationship with technology, right? And how that's influenced our evolution over time. Well, you could start with stone tools. That's a big deal, right? Having stone tools and axes and things like that. You can proceed to the evolution of agriculture and new food sources that's impacted our genome. So, throughout humanity's evolution, our technologies have impacted our bodies and our physiologies in a very big way, whether it's domestication of animals, whether it's hunting, whether it's stone tools. But if you look at the last, 100 years, I mean, our relationship with technology has entirely changed, and obviously it's changing at an ever increasing rate. And so the question is, to be able to make the prediction you want, I have to be able to predict what the technologies are going to be, and what the environment is, and what's the environment going to look like in 100 years. I don't even know what the environment's going to look like in 5 years. I mean, with the way AI has been just transforming the way we work and think, and our relationship to our own work and technologies and so forth. So that it is not punting in the sense that I think one probably could predict in a sense, but you'd have to have a better prediction than I can do of what the relevant environment that we'd be living in say 50 years, 100 years. And yeah, I mean, we're going to be offloading a lot of cognitive functions, I'd imagine. But we've already offloaded a lot. No, it's not just, I mean, you think about how technology has impacted all our bodies. I'm wearing eyeglasses, and I wouldn't have lived to 7 years old in the savannah, right? This technology has made a deleterious mutation, which I have in my sight, neutral, functionally neutral. And we're doing that at a ever increasing scale with all kinds of other technologies, whether they're, chips and brains or AI or what have you.
Yeah, and also like in soft robotics, we kind of often use the redundancy for some other purposes, right? Repurposing redundancy of the system. Maybe like John, Rob, and Michael can make some comments about the repurposing and redundancy from the robotics point of view.
John's kind of almost shaking his head a little bit. Do you want to go first, John?
No, I just, every time I have a good question, someone else steals it. I feel kind of cheated. I don't have any specific responses to that. So I'll pass it on to Robert.
Oh yeah, okay. Well, I guess I view it as multifunctionality and less than redundancy. Actually, could you give a specific example of redundant system featured in soft robotics?
Yeah, like for example, like locomotion, like something is probably not used during the normal operation, but something happens and then some other organ is repurposed to do some other tasks.
I see. Okay. Yeah, in my view of it is most robots are modular design, like each system is for a specific purpose, whereas in soft robotics there's a move towards integral design of sort of diffusing the functionality of the different things. Like the actuator is the body, the fluid is the energy, these things. So in a way, I feel I might go the opposite direction, and there's less redundancy, because if one thing fails, now not just the actuators failed, the bodies failed, and things like that. So it might be too much in one direction.
Yeah, I think I agree with Rob in that, especially with traditional soft robotics things like pneumatics, right? Often you see if you have one puncture, everything goes down. And whether or not this is a function of us concerned about other things or not having to confront the problem of operating in the real world or in the field, right? Maybe we're not incentivized to solve these problems in soft robotics yet, but I agree. It's potentially a really big problem if we keep going down this path.
Or maybe it's also we don't quite have the complexity in technologies yet, because we do see these nanos, like we had this talk from this morning on Sylvester and Maxera about using the null space in the brain to control extranumerary limbs. So it's interesting, as will robots head in that way if we can actually have more complex fabrication capabilities such that we can deal with unknowns or challenging environments. We are out of time, so I would just like to thank very much all our panelists panelists and speakers today. And just if anybody has a last word they would like to say on this topic of evolutionary looking forwards, I don't know if anybody has a last comment to make to finish us off from the session. Any takers?
I don't know, the thought I want a whole other talk about is why we can't have a neuroethological fossil record, and how convenient that would be if we could if we could have fossils of nervous structures and neuroethology.
Yeah, yep. That's a interesting thought. If only that would change things a lot. So yes.
Yeah,
I have
So-
this idea of control structures being conserved across evolution.
Yeah.
Like we can only look at living systems to infer that.
Yeah.
By and large, I guess.
There was a at
Well, I
Robo-
mean, we do have. I'm sorry, Robert. I didn't mean to cut you off.
I did at RoboSoft in Edinburgh, 2021, I think. There was a speaker. I wish I could remember his name. Very interesting talk, and he talked about evolutionary. Like our hands aren't ideal. It's just we adapted them, and there's a term for that. I was hoping one of the speakers might be able to just remind me what that was. Where it's sort of like we all think of biology as optimal because of evolution, but it's not. It's just making the best use of the thing that happened at the time. There's a phrase for it that I thought was really powerful, but I've been trying to remember it for years. And this just seems like a good opportunity to ask.
Yeah, I forget what I mean, I know the concept you're talking about is something we're really familiar with, because evolution is, we have local optimum everywhere, but we have the global optimum. Yeah, just to answer John's question a little bit, I mean, we do have some data that is not entirely useless. Yeah, well, we don't have a whole, profile of these animals. We have trackways. We have the ways that that creatures have interacted with mud as they walk and slither and stuff like that. And so, it's not totally hopeless. I mean, it's largely hopeless, but it's, there's a glimmer of some data that if you're fortunate, you'll have it. So
yeah, cool. Well, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to all our speakers, panelists, participants, and thank you very much for everyone who's joining us today. So just to conclude, we're now going to move to a further set of breakout sessions and talks. So those will be open very briefly, and then please do join. And then just to say, we start again tomorrow at 9:15 GMT, where we have another set of 3 plenary speakers, panels, short talks, breakout rooms. So please join us today, and we will upload all the talks recorded today online as soon as we have. So thank you very much to everyone for joining. Please do join us tomorrow, and then I would just now like to open the breakout room sessions. So please do. We've got 3 rooms now, so please do go and join them. If you have any problems joining them, just put it in the chat, and then we will move you to that room. So thank you very much, everyone, and see you tomorrow. Thank you.